Hi everyone, my name is Ryan J. A. Murphy. I'm recording this talk titled Movements for Dancing with Systems, Designing Strategies for Scaling Systems Change for the Strategy Design for Social Innovation course at TU Delft. I'm going to post this talk to YouTube though, just in case it's useful to anybody else. And with that, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to dive right in. At the core of this talk are two fundamentals of innovation that I discovered or uncovered while I was studying innovation in 2015. And I'm just going to walk you through these two ideas because they relate directly to some of the stuff we're talking about later. So the first of this idea is, or the first fundamental of innovation here is, say you want to solve a problem, conceptualized here by this angry red circle, and you've got a glorious golden yellow idea that you have that will solve that problem. Well, innovation is systemic, and that means that to make that yellow circle happen, you actually need to realize several other kinds of innovations in parallel or preceding it in order to make it a reality. The smartphone app couldn't exist without the user interface design ideas that go into making it, right? So that's the first fundamental. The second fundamental is that, well, once you've introduced an idea into the world, you've made some change, that change unlocks the possibility for future changes, for future innovations to take root as well. Basically, innovations are fractal, and an innovation facilitates the creation of other future innovations on the basis of that first innovation. So these two kind of principles. And by the way, this happens over time. Everything we've ever interacted with is the result of this interaction between systemic and fractal innovations. And so these two concepts underlie the core sort of inquiry that we're engaging in this research project, which is, how might we use the systemic fractal nature of innovation to design better strategies for systems change? And there are three sort of sub-questions for this. The first is, what are the possible forms of systemic innovation? Unfortunately, we have some work to build on here from Darcy Riddle and Michelle Lee Moore and Gord Tulloch, who I'll introduce in a second. The second sub-question is, how do these forms of systemic change relate to one another? And that's going to be the thesis. That's the core of the ideas here that I want to introduce to you. And the third sub-question is, if we actually can recognize different forms of systemic change, and we can figure out how they relate to one another, then can we anticipate them? And if we anticipate them, does that mean we can design better strategies for change by linking all these things together? And so to move forward, I'm going to introduce some work from those three authors I mentioned before, who problematized and typified strategies for scaling systems change or social innovation. So the first of this work was by Darcy Riddle and Michelle Lee Moore and a bunch of their colleagues, and they were studying how exactly some organizations scale the social innovations that they are introducing into the world. So they started with this question of how might we scale up systems change, and yet they realized that this framing of scaling up actually comes from business. It comes from the private sector, and it doesn't really fit when we're talking about social innovations. So they tried to flip that around, and they came up with this idea that actually there are different ways of conceptualizing how scaling social innovation happens. They came up with these three concepts: scaling up, scaling out, and scaling deep. Gord Tulloch came along afterwards and added two other kinds of scaling to that framework: scree scaling. So scree is the rubble on a mountainside that as an avalanche or a landslide starts to take shape, it's that scree, those little tiny rocks that sort of build up and become a huge landslide in the end. So to scale scree is to legitimize and cultivate all kinds of solutions to the problem that you're trying to solve. And then the fifth type of scaling that he introduced is to scale initial conditions. That is, to try and make sure that there are lots of resources and no barriers standing in the way of other new innovations to show up to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. A core idea at the root of all of these different types of scaling is that scaling means falling in love with the problem. It means you're not necessarily only trying to make your solution, your innovation happens. It means you're trying to address and solve some problem in the world, and you're willing to try and support many solutions to that problem in order to make sure that the problem goes away. So these authors offered a great contribution because it gives us new language for the explanation and assessment of systems change work and social innovation. It also gives us new ways to plan for systems change, right? If you think about it, and in fact somebody already has, you can design frameworks that take advantage of these kinds of scaling in order to help you plan your innovation over time. And so this is a tool by Kudos. Kudos.ca is their website. And the idea is to help you map out where you're stuck and where you need enablement in order to make progress on whatever the systems problem you're working on might be. So wait, let's go back though to this question that started all this work, which was how might we scale up systems change? Riddle and Moore rightly sort of wondered why scale up is the term we'd use here, and by turning it on its head, they changed this concept to scale. So the question becomes, how might we scale systems change? And yet, why are we using the idea of scaling at all? What does scaling actually mean? And if we look at this sort of reactionary approach to developing and identifying different forms of systems change, we might realize that, well, if we're developing all these new concepts from a response to what is a problematic metaphor, a metaphor from production, we might be constraining the way we think and limiting ourselves from thinking of other ways change happens. So, in other words, the scale metaphor doesn't really work. It comes from production. It's this idea that you can increase the amount you're outputting by proportionally increasing your inputs. And it can be stretched to fit some kinds of systems change, but it might restrict what else we're able to see and think about. And so just work with me for a second. What is the point of scaling systems change? What are we talking about when we talk about scaling? Well, we're talking about changing systems. We're talking about how to produce changed systems. So if we work backwards from these ideas that I introduced at the start of this talk, if a change is systemic and fractal, then a changed system has gone through a set of changes from an initial configuration to some new one that is hopefully better. Donella Meadows famously described this kind of iterative incrementalism as dancing with systems. And so I'd argue that we're actually not talking about necessarily scaling change. We're actually talking about movements. We're talking about how change moves through a system. And yes, we can use the term scale sort of back and forth with movement. But if we think about these different types of change as different ways of moving through the system, it unlocks a sort of interesting creative idea that I'll use to describe a few other maybe possible kinds of scaling in a second. So just to reiterate, what we're talking about here is how a system changes over time. And by looking at these movements as the necessary steps to transform systems, we might come up with ways of changing different types of change over time in order to really deeply understand what a good strategy looks like. So that's a lot. I'm going to walk you through an example in a second, but first I'll reintroduce those 5 different types of scaling that we just heard about. I'll introduce 3 more that came from that reframing, and then I'll walk you through an example that hopefully makes this a bit more practical. So, to scale out or to move out is to change production. This means to replicate or disseminate your solution to reach more people, to solve more instances of a problem. To scale up is to change policy. This means to shift rules that either enable the propagation of more innovations that solve the problem or prevent and stop the propagation or perpetuation of the problem in the first place. To scale deep is to change perception, it's to change mindsets, to change paradigms. This means reframing the perspectives of the system stakeholders on the problems and innovations that could affect the system so they might think differently and therefore start to act differently. To scale across and this is a reframing of Gord Tulloch's idea of scaling scree. To scale across a system, to move change across a system is to change participation. This means distributing attention to more parts of the system, legitimizing other different innovations that might solve the problem, or trying to draw attention to other parts of the problem so that those also get solved. To scale down is to change the power structure. It's to make sure that you're facilitating conditions for accessing resources or removing barriers for innovation. To scale in is to learn. It's to draw in new knowledge about the problems or innovations you're trying to solve and then make progress on by coming up with new ideas in order to solve those problems. And to scale long is to find new ways of sustaining innovations over time. Say you've come up with a new program that affects poverty, then you want to make sure that you are not investing a bunch of resources in that program over time in order to keep it going. You want to try to find ways to make it self-sustaining. And then finally, and this is the most interesting one in my opinion, to scale back is to borrow from panarchy, this idea that an institution, as it builds up over time, locks in resources. There's a lot of money and people that are attached to any given institution or any given initiative in a systems change work. So to scale something back is to release those resources back, to recognize that there are times when it's best to actually step back and to let the system adapt to the new state of things so that the system itself kind of perpetuates the new configuration that you want to see, rather than you always being present in order to keep the change going. So I realize that this might be a bit abstract, and what I'll do now for the next couple of minutes is just walk you through a personal example, and then I'll leave you to it. And if you've got any questions, you can always email me. I'll repeat this at the end, but ryan@fulcra.design is my email address, and feel free to reach out. So, an example, procrastination and anxiety. This actually comes from my own work on procrastination, and I'm going to show you how these different kinds of change can layer over time and produce a changed system. So I've been working on my procrastination problems for ages. For over a decade, I sought ways to limit distraction and be better organized, right? Find better ways to organize projects and tasks. And so recently, I underwent a deep systemic change, and realized that maybe the problem wasn't actually all these distractions, and maybe it wasn't the task apps that I'm using. Maybe I need to rethink how I'm approaching my procrastination problems, and maybe the problem is actually rooted in my personality and the kind of behaviors that I have when I interact with my work. And so that first change was a deep change. And then I started to read about procrastination, and this is actually an inward strategy, scaling in. I tried to learn more about the potential problems that can cause procrastination and what the possible solutions to those are. This led me to actually reach out to a counselor, which is a kind of downward and across change. By booking a biweekly counselor, I set up the conditions for feedback so that I could, or I had to, sort of act each week on my behaviors and then talk to somebody about it so I could get feedback on how exactly changes were happening. And it was across because it drew my attention to other possible changes, other possible interventions that I wasn't aware of, other possibilities. Next, and this is where I am right now, is trying out new approaches. And this means, learning more about a particular kind of idea, say interoception or transactional analysis. Scaling up in changing the rules that I use to engage with my work and to engage with the things that cause me to procrastinate. And then scaling out as I find things that work, trying to figure out how to apply them to other instances of procrastination in my work life. And then this is a cycle. This repeats. Eventually, I should try to make sure that these new habits are sustained, finding ways to scale them along. And then eventually, hopefully, I'll be able to scale back the deliberate effort I've been putting into this work, stop having to have a counselor, and stop having to intensely focus on this problem, and just live in a different way. Change the system that is me, my work, and my interaction with it. So hopefully this gives you an example of how these different types of scaling, these different movements in systems, in dancing with systems, can be layered on top of each other, and how this is actually a really necessary part of systems change. And ultimately, by being able to characterize these problems, these kinds of changes, these strategies in these different ways, and I'll go back just to show you this slide one more time with these 8 sort of dimensions. If we can figure out how to how we can characterize a strategy in terms of these different kinds of change, then maybe we can, in advance, build really robust, really effective strategies for systems change, because we will recognize that, hey, we don't know enough about this problem. We need to scale in. Or, hey, there are lots of different actors trying to make things happen in the system. Maybe we need to scale across. Maybe we need to move our change across the system in order to enable all of those actors to have impact. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, my email is ryan@fulcra.design, ryan@fulcra.design. Design. I'll put it in the YouTube link or in the YouTube description. Reach out if you have any questions or if you want to discuss this further. Hopefully you got something out of it. Thanks very much.